He didn't trust the nanny he hired for his paralyzed son and installed hidden cameras in the house. But what he saw on the tapes changed his idea of trust, care, and real family forever. Subscribe to the channel. Where are you watching from? Write in the comments. The morning light filtered through the expansive glass walls of the Carter estate, casting pale golden stripes across the gleaming floors. The house, tucked into the hills just north of Los Angeles, was silent but alive, its systems humming beneath polished surfaces, automated blinds adjusting as the sun crept higher. Yet inside, the silence wasn't just one of comfort or affluence. It was the kind of silence that settled deep into walls, into the spaces between rooms and people. It was the silence of a home holding its breath. James Carter stood at the edge of his son's room, a porcelain mug of untouched coffee cooling in his hands. He didn't look at the monitors today. He didn't need to. The boy hadn't spoken in weeks. A year and a half had passed since the accident, and Miles had spoken only when required, and even then his voice was the fragile echo of what it once was. No protests, no laughter, not even the sharp, impatient questions that had once filled this very room. Miles sat in his wheelchair by the window, thin arms folded across his lap, eyes trained somewhere far beyond the glass. His dark curls had grown unruly, shadowing his brow, and his face, once round with boyish mischief, had hollowed subtly, hardened with a stillness that was difficult to witness. His legs, motionless, were tucked beneath a soft blanket, more for dignity than warmth. James remained in the doorway longer than he intended to. He wanted to say something, to ask a question, anything, but the words clotted at the back of his throat. Instead, he turned away, walking briskly down the corridor to his office, where a wall of screens and data awaited. This was where he understood the world. Here, everything had logic. Everything could be measured, forecasted, controlled. He was the founder and CEO of a billion-dollar tech conglomerate. Streamlined logistics, artificial intelligence systems, corporate security frameworks. He had been on the covers of Fortune, Time, and Forbes, a symbol of calculated brilliance, self-made and unflinchingly efficient. Raised by a single mother in South Central, James had clawed his way out of poverty with intellect and sheer will, learning early that control was safety. Emotion, he discovered young, was liability, but grief did not obey rules. No system could predict it. His wife, Carmen, had been the one to believe in healing, in things unmeasured by numbers. She had taken Miles to music lessons, bought him watercolor sets, told bedtime stories without ever repeating the same one twice. She'd been the warmth in the room. That morning, a year and a half ago, when he was stuck in traffic and Carmen had insisted on picking up Miles alone, he'd argued briefly before relenting. He still remembered the sound of her laugh over the phone. "We'll be fine, Jay. It's just a little rain." It wasn't. The collision happened on a wet stretch of road, an out-of-control delivery truck, a split second. Carmen died instantly. Miles survived, but the trauma left his spinal cord damaged beyond repair. His legs never moved again. James had been at the hospital within the hour, but everything after that day existed in fragments. ICU corridors, the sound of machines, funeral arrangements, therapists with soft voices, friends with condolences that sounded like apologies. He buried himself in work, trying to keep the business moving, trying to give Miles the best doctors, the best equipment, the best of everything. But none of it mattered when his son barely looked at him. At first, he believed time would fix things, that a child's resilience would bring Miles back, but the months passed. The silence deepened. The weight of it grew unbearable. He hired specialists, therapists, counselors. Most didn't last. Some said Miles wasn't responsive, others claimed he needed a change of environment. James interviewed more candidates than he could count, and all of them blurred together. Overqualified, underprepared, insincere. None of them lasted beyond a week. It was his executive assistant who brought Kelsey Clare to his attention. K. Clare, the resume had read. Her references were modest but solid. Several years of experience in pediatric care, time spent volunteering in a children's hospice program, and a note from a former employer that read simply, "The kind of person who makes silence feel safe." That last line caught James off guard. He almost passed it over, but something in those words stayed with him. He agreed to an interview. She arrived at the estate the following Friday, a single bag slung over one shoulder, her hair tied back in a simple knot. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, and her dress was plainly cut, yet it suited her in a way that made her presence feel intentional. She had pale skin, eyes like worn sea glass, and a voice that didn't force itself into the room. She answered his questions with clarity, never overstepping, never retreating. There was no pity in her demeanor, just a quiet readiness. James watched her closely during the interview. Her posture, the way she didn't fidget, how she looked him in the eye without challenge. When he asked what she would do if Miles didn't respond to her, she replied, "I'd still show up. Silence is a language, too." He hired her for a 30-day trial. Before she moved into the guest suite on the east side of the house, James had surveillance installed in the main common areas, Miles's room, the kitchen. Discreet, high-grade cameras. Nothing obtrusive, nothing that would make the house feel monitored. But he needed to know. Trust wasn't something he extended easily, especially not when it came to his son. The first days passed slowly. Claire, or Miss Clare, as she asked to be called, kept her distance. She didn't press Miles to engage. She greeted him each morning with the same quiet voice, read aloud as she sat near the window, and spent the afternoons in the garden or kitchen, always within earshot, but never invasive. Miles ignored her entirely. James watched the footage each night, combing through the hours with forensic precision. He noted her tone, her posture, how she handled the wheelchair, how often she looked directly at the boy. He noted the way she never showed disappointment when he didn't respond. She was patient in a way that wasn't performative, and she didn't try to make herself smaller in the silence. One evening, he caught something unexpected. Claire sat cross-legged on the floor, sketchbook in hand, humming softly. The tune wasn't familiar, something improvised probably. Miles sat near her, still as ever, his gaze fixed on the book in her hands. She didn't address him directly. Instead, she narrated what she was drawing: a tree with too many branches, a bear that looked more like a cat. Her tone was light, almost playful. Miles didn't speak, but after a while, James noticed something subtle. His son's fingers twitched against the armrest, a gesture so slight it might have been accidental. But James had watched enough footage to know the difference between nothing and almost something. The next day, Claire placed a blank page and a pencil on Miles's desk and said nothing. She didn't point to it, didn't prompt him. She simply left it there. Later that afternoon, when James checked the camera, he saw a faint series of lines, tentative, uncertain, but undeniably drawn by hand. He leaned back in his chair, stunned. It was the first autonomous action Miles had taken in months. It wasn't progress in the clinical sense, but for James, it was seismic. Over the following week, more of these moments began to appear. Claire continued her quiet routines, sometimes reading aloud, sometimes sketching, sometimes sitting in silence. Once, she rolled the piano closer to Miles and played a simple melody with one hand. He didn't respond, but his head tilted slightly, as if tracking the sound. And once, just once, he laughed. A short, surprised burst of breath that followed one of Claire's absurd stories about a hedgehog that wanted to become an astronaut. James was watching live. The laugh rang through the speakers like a bell. He sat motionless for a long time afterward, staring at the screen, his hands numb around his glass of water. Something had shifted. It was too early to name it, too fragile to examine, but it was there. Still, James hesitated. This woman, this pale, southern-born stranger, was becoming a fixture in his son's life. And though he saw her gentleness, her sincerity, some part of him resisted. Not because she was doing something wrong, but because she was doing something right. And he wasn't. He had built a world that obeyed his rules. But within its quietest corner, a new kind of order was forming, one he didn't control. And for the first time in years, James Carter wasn't sure what to do. The rhythm of the house had changed. It was not dramatic or obvious, but it had shifted, like the slow turning of a tide beneath still water. James noticed it in the smallest things. The way the staff moved through the corridors, the tone of Miles's voice, though still sparse, when he asked for a glass of water or the book on the far shelf. Even the silence seemed different now, not as brittle or final. It had taken only 2 weeks, but Claire's presence was beginning to alter the very fabric of their home. Each evening, James reviewed the footage. At first, it had been a matter of precaution, a silent contract he made with himself. Protect the boy, monitor the stranger. But now it had become something else. A ritual. He told himself he was studying her methods, trying to understand how she reached his son in ways no one else had. But he knew, deep down, it was more than that. There was a moment he returned to more than once. Claire sat on the carpet near the fireplace, her back against the armrest of the sofa. She had placed a small canvas in front of her and painted with calm, deliberate strokes, narrating her choices as though to herself. "This shade is too bright. Maybe a little more blue." Miles sat nearby in his chair, head slightly turned, his fingers resting on the wheels. He said nothing, but his eyes were on the brush. James watched him watching her. That day, Claire left a second canvas beside her finished one. She said nothing. When she returned an hour later, there were 3 strokes of color on the blank surface: green, blue, and a hesitant smear of yellow. James remembered pausing the video, studying it, as if the colors might speak to him. It was not the painting that moved him. It was what it meant. Miles had made a choice, he had acted, and no one had told him to. Claire continued in that same vein. No pressure, no praise that felt forced. She left space for silence. She left room for Miles to choose, and he did, slowly, cautiously. One afternoon, James came home early. His meetings had ended sooner than expected, and instead of returning to the office, he had instructed his driver to take him directly to the house. He didn't announce himself. He walked quietly through the hall, stopping at the edge of the library. There they were. Claire was seated on the floor with a book in her lap. She read aloud, her voice steady and soft like water slipping over stones. Miles was near her, one hand idly tracing a line in the rug. He wasn't looking at her, but his body was angled toward her. He was listening. James watched them without moving. He felt something tighten in his chest. It was a strange emotion. Pride, perhaps, or sorrow. Maybe both. It was difficult to name. He had not seen his son so engaged in over a year. He returned to his study without announcing his presence. That night, he didn't review the footage. He didn't need to. The days unfolded with similar quiet revelations. One morning, Claire placed a stack of old records on the table, brushing dust from their sleeves. James recognized them instantly. They had belonged to Carmen. Jazz, soul, a few classical pieces she'd loved in college. Claire didn't ask for permission. She simply placed a record on the player in the corner of the den and let the music fill the room. The notes floated through the air like ghosts of memory, and for the first time since Carmen's death, James didn't feel assaulted by them. Later that afternoon, he passed by the music room. Through the cracked door, he saw Claire at the piano, playing a soft, halting melody. Miles sat nearby, his hand resting on the keys, guided gently by hers. James stepped back before they could see him, leaning against the wall. He stayed there a long time, his eyes closed. The staff had begun to notice the changes as well. The housekeeper mentioned that Miles had started to request meals again. Small things, toast with cinnamon sugar, tomato soup. The cook smiled when she said it, though she quickly masked her expression in James's presence. In his own quiet way, James was beginning to unravel. Not in chaos, but in the loosening of the walls he had so carefully constructed. He found himself spending less time in the office. His phone sat ignored for longer stretches. Once, he even closed his laptop mid-email when he heard laughter from the garden. It wasn't just Miles laughing. Claire laughed too, a low, honest sound that caught James off guard. He didn't know when he'd last heard such a sound in this house. And yet, with every step forward, shadows followed. It began with a comment from a neighbor, an older woman who lived 3 estates down and had known Carmen through a charity board. They crossed paths near the entrance gate, and she offered a tight-lipped smile. "I hear you've taken on some new help," she said, her voice syrupy. "A young lady from Georgia, is it?" James didn't answer. She leaned in slightly. "You know, I admire your efforts, really, but these things can be complicated." It wasn't her words that burned. It was her tone, the insinuation, the unspoken suggestion that a white woman working so intimately in a black man's home was somehow improper. James walked away without a response, but the seed was planted. That night, he sat in his study long after the house had gone still. He didn't turn on the monitors. He didn't need to watch Claire to doubt her. He thought of his mother's voice, low and serious, telling him never to forget where he came from. "You can own the suit," she had once said, "but they'll still see you in chains if you're not careful." He poured himself a drink he didn't want and stared at the ice as it melted. The following day, as if summoned by his unease, another moment unsettled him. Claire had taken Miles for a walk through the garden paths behind the estate. The security feed captured them from a distance. As they paused near the magnolia trees, a different neighbor appeared, this time a woman walking her dog. She stopped when she saw them and offered a polite nod. "Beautiful day," she said. Claire returned the greeting with a smile. The woman hesitated. "He's such a lovely boy. Must be quite a job. I imagine it's fulfilling work." There was something in her voice, condescension, or perhaps skepticism, that made James tense even from behind a screen. Claire didn't flinch. "He's not a job," she said simply. "He's a person." The woman blinked, then muttered something about her dog and walked on. James leaned back in his chair, staring at the screen. He hadn't expected the quiet conviction in Claire's voice. She hadn't raised it, hadn't allowed emotion to color it. She had simply drawn a line. For the first time, James felt something that resembled trust. It came slowly over the following days, when he noticed the way Claire adjusted the wheelchair cushion without being asked, how she instinctively knew when Miles was tired, how she respected his silences as though they were spoken words. He began spending more time in the living room during the hours she was with Miles, not participating, just present. He would sit in the armchair with a book, eyes moving across the pages, though he rarely absorbed what he read. He was watching without watching, and he noticed everything. How Claire never interrupted, how she allowed Miles space to withdraw, but also space to return, how she spoke to him not as a fragile thing, but as a boy with intelligence, with agency. She never forced eye contact. She never praised him for trivial things. When he drew, she studied the lines and asked about them. Not what they were, but what he felt when he made them. When he played a broken chord, she didn't correct him. She played something equally broken, and they laughed. James remembered watching that moment, their laughter weaving through the room like light through branches. It was unguarded, uncalculated, and it had nothing to do with him. He wasn't jealous, not exactly, but something in him ached. Late one evening, as he passed the open door of the guest room, he heard Claire's voice, quiet and rhythmic. She was singing, barely above a whisper, a lullaby unfamiliar to him. Perhaps a hymn, perhaps something from her childhood. The melody hung in the air like the last note of a piano piece, suspended and fragile. James paused outside the door, listening. He didn't speak to her, he didn't ask questions, but the ice was thinning beneath his feet, and he knew it. Each night, as the sun dipped behind the hills, casting long shadows across the floor, James felt something inside him shift. He had built his life on control, on structure. But this slow, quiet unraveling, was something else entirely. He wasn't afraid of losing control. He was afraid of wanting something he couldn't calculate, couldn't command. And for the first time in years, he wondered if healing was less about fixing and more about letting go. Spring came slowly that year, as if uncertain whether it would be welcomed. The mornings were still cool, veiled in fog that rolled down from the hills, softening the edges of the Carter estate. Yet, beneath that haze, the first hints of life stirred. The blooming of stubborn crocuses near the edge of the garden, the shifting scents of the earth, the occasional bird song slicing through the morning stillness. Inside the house, something similar was happening. James Carter noticed it first not in some grand revelation, but in an almost mundane moment. One Thursday evening, as he stepped into the kitchen in search of coffee, he found Claire and Miles seated at the breakfast bar, each holding a piece of toast. It was a modest meal, jam smeared in imperfect circles, crust discarded in a shared napkin, but the boy was smiling, teeth bared, crumbs dusting his lip. Claire was mid-story, her hands moving expressively. James didn't catch the beginning, only the end. And then the goose just walked off like nothing had happened. Miles laughed so suddenly he choked a little, and Claire reached over to hand him water, gently patting his back. James stood for a long moment in the doorway, watching, unseen. There was no drama in the scene, no milestone being celebrated. But he felt keenly that something essential had shifted. His son was present, not just existing in the room, but alive within it. He began to linger more after that, not spying or listening from shadows, but placing himself in proximity. Some evenings he'd sit in the armchair near the fireplace, feigning interest in a book while Claire and Miles worked on puzzles or played music. Other times he'd join them briefly at the table, adding a piece or offering a word of encouragement before withdrawing. Always cautious, always composed. One Saturday morning, Miles asked him directly, "Dad, are you staying today?" James hesitated. He looked at Claire, who didn't respond, giving him space to choose his answer. "Yes," he said, the words surprising him. "I thought I might." Miles didn't say anything more, but James noticed how the boy's shoulders relaxed, how he leaned back into his chair as though allowing himself to enjoy the moment. They spent the day together. Claire suggested a simple art project, cutting images from magazines and arranging them into a vision board, though she never called it that aloud. They worked around the kitchen table, scissors and glue scattered, laughter growing less guarded with each passing hour. James found himself absorbed, flipping through a stack of travel magazines, selecting an image of a quiet cove. "I think we should go there," he said aloud without meaning to. Miles looked at the photo. "Is that Greece?" "Somewhere on the coast," James replied. "Your mom always wanted to visit." Miles didn't answer, but he reached over and glued the image to the center of their board. The connection between them was no longer hypothetical. It wasn't something James observed at a distance. It was real, growing, delicate, and it terrified him. He found himself thinking about Claire in ways he hadn't allowed before, not just as the caregiver who had brought his son back to life, but as a presence he had come to depend on. She was so often calm that he sometimes forgot the strength beneath her quiet. But it revealed itself in her constancy, in the way she never demanded attention, never performed affection, never asked for praise. She simply was. He remembered watching her one morning in the garden, sleeves rolled up, dirt smudged on her forearm as she helped Miles repot a small flowering plant. They weren't speaking. Claire moved slowly, explaining the steps only once, then letting Miles do the work. James could have watched them for hours, but desire, even the quiet kind, brought with it confusion. He questioned himself. Was this real, or just gratitude misplaced? Was he seeing her clearly, or through the lens of his own emotional hunger? And did it matter? His past whispered warnings. He had learned early to guard against weakness, to avoid entanglements that could complicate or corrupt. His success had always relied on distance, on sharp lines between professional and personal, employer and employee, man and woman. But now those lines were blurring. He wasn't the only one feeling it. One evening, after Miles had gone to bed, James walked past the library and noticed the door slightly ajar. Claire sat in one of the armchairs, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked tired in a way he hadn't seen before. Her usual composure was still there, but something in her expression had softened. He didn't intend to enter, but she looked up and their eyes met. "You can come in," she said, not as an invitation, but as a simple statement of fact. He stepped inside, unsure what to say. He hadn't prepared for this. "You've been staying later," he said finally. "Yes," she replied, sipping her tea. "Miles sleeps better when he knows I'm here." There was no implication in her tone, no expectation. Still, James felt air shift around them. "I wanted to thank you," he said, "for everything." She met his gaze, quiet. "You don't have to." "I do," he insisted. "You've done more for him in a few months than I managed in a year." She didn't contradict him. She didn't soften the statement. Instead, she said, "He missed you. That's what he needed." James lowered his gaze. "I didn't know how." Claire said nothing, and somehow the silence between them was more honest than any words. Over the next week, their conversations grew longer. Never indulgent, never confessional, but warmer. James began to ask about her past, not prying but curious. She answered sparingly. She'd grown up in Georgia, the eldest of three. Her father had died young. Her mother had struggled. She'd taken care of her younger siblings, including a sister with cerebral palsy. She didn't speak of it with sadness, only with clarity. Her choices had always been guided by necessity. James found himself listening differently than he had before, not just to her words, but to the spaces around them. He sensed how carefully she had built her life, how deliberately she had chosen where to give her energy. It made him realize how recklessly he had spent his own. One evening, a storm rolled over the hills, darkening the sky, rain tapping against the windows in an irregular rhythm. Thunder cracked and the lights flickered. Miles, asleep in his room, woke with a cry. James rushed upstairs, but by the time he reached the hallway, Claire was already there. She sat on the edge of Miles's bed, murmuring something low. The boy clung to her shirt, face buried, body rigid. James froze. He wanted to step in, to take over, to be the one who comforted his son. But something stopped him. Perhaps it was the way Claire held Miles, not as a professional doing her duty, but as someone offering genuine, steady love. Not the dramatic kind, the enduring kind. She didn't tell him it was okay. She didn't dismiss his fear. She just held him and breathed with him until his body relaxed. James watched, feeling helpless and grateful all at once. Later that night, when the storm had passed and the house was silent again, he stood outside on the patio, the scent of wet earth rising from the stones. Claire joined him without a word, her cardigan pulled close. They stood side by side for a long time. Finally, he said, "I keep thinking I should be doing more." "You're here," she said. "That's more than enough." He turned to her. "Is it?" She met his gaze. "Only you can answer that." He wanted to touch her hand. He didn't, but the impulse stayed with him long after she went inside. In the days that followed, the three of them settled into a rhythm that felt less like routine and more like life. They cooked together, they played games, they argued, even, small disagreements over music, over which movie to watch, over whether pineapple belonged on pizza. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. One weekend, James suggested a trip to the country house. It had been years since he'd been there. Carmen had loved the place, its long, sloping fields, the old wooden dock over the lake. He hadn't returned since her funeral. Miles's eyes lit up at the mention. Claire hesitated, then nodded. They left the next morning. The drive was quiet but easy, filled with passing conversation and shared playlists. The country house stood as it always had, a little worn, but still warm. Claire opened windows to let in the breeze. Miles insisted on being wheeled down to the lake first thing. They spent the afternoon by the water. James fished while Miles narrated the process, Claire teasing them both. When the sun began to dip, they built a small fire and roasted marshmallows. After Miles fell asleep that night, Claire and James remained outside, sitting beneath the stars, wrapped in blankets. She looked up at the sky and said, "I never thought I'd end up here." He didn't ask where she thought she'd be. "I didn't either," he replied. There was a long pause, then he turned to her. "You're not just part of his life anymore." Claire looked at him. "I know." "I don't know what that means," he said quietly. "Not yet." She reached for his hand. "It means we figure it out." And somehow in that still, starlit night, James Carter believed they would. A year had passed, not in a way that marked itself with fanfare or grand transitions, but like a slow tide wearing smooth the edges of something once jagged. The Carter estate no longer felt like a monument to silence. Life moved through it in the soft rhythm of familiar steps, gentle voices, shared meals, and the steady pulse of presence. It breathed now, not loudly, but steadily, surely. James woke earlier these days, often before the rest of the house stirred. He liked to stand in the doorway of Miles's room, watching his son sleep peacefully, the covers curled around his legs, a small plush toy tucked beneath one arm. It was the same toy Claire had given him months ago, purchased on a whim during a grocery run, with no significance beyond a silly smile and a soft texture. And yet, Miles had taken to it instantly, naming it Pilot and refusing to sleep without it. James never asked why. He didn't need to. Children chose what made them feel safe. He often found himself downstairs next, where the scent of breakfast had started to greet him long before he entered the kitchen. Claire was always there first, already awake, already busy, already humming a half-familiar tune under her breath. Not every morning, but enough that he had come to associate that quiet song with the smell of toast and cinnamon. Sometimes Miles joined them early, wheeling himself into the room with a sleepy grin and demanding orange juice before even saying good morning. Other times, he lingered upstairs, calling down a request for pancakes or asking James to carry him down, just because. James always obliged. These routines weren't planned. They had grown, layer by layer, out of moments of necessity and love, like ivy climbing the wall, uncontrolled but not chaotic. There was no schedule posted on the fridge, no rules, only understanding. Miles had changed the most, not in the dramatic way some might expect, not in a miraculous recovery or a sudden flood of words, but in the quiet blossoming of a child who had been given the right light and soil to grow. His laugh had returned first, hesitant but genuine. Then came questions about books, about music, about the way the stars moved. Then opinions on Claire's cooking, on his father's driving, on the quality of cartoons. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, his world had widened again. James marveled at it sometimes. How so much could return with so little noise. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Friends and colleagues who had once offered only stiff condolences began to visit the estate again, invited by James with newfound ease. He no longer felt the need to impress or isolate. He introduced Claire without explanation, with neither apology nor formality. She was there. That was all that mattered. One afternoon, James hosted a small gathering in the garden, a barbecue for a few investors and longtime friends. Claire helped prepare the meal, working quietly in the background, while Miles moved between groups with the ease of a practiced host. He cracked jokes, asked thoughtful questions, and offered his own homemade lemonade, which he insisted was superior to any store-bought version. No one corrected him. No one wanted to. Later that evening, after the guests had gone, James found himself sitting on the back steps, shoes off, his shirt sleeves rolled up. Claire joined him with 2 glasses of iced tea, passing one into his hand without a word. They sat in companionable silence, watching Miles chase fireflies with a long-handled net, determined to catch and release each one without harm. "He's fearless," James said quietly, more to himself than to her. Claire smiled. "He trusts the world again." James looked at her. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because of us." The word hung in the air between them, not heavy, but full. In the weeks that followed, James began making quiet moves behind the scenes. Papers were signed, trusts were modified. Claire's name was added to certain documents, not as employee or caretaker, but as a person of legal standing in the household. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was something close. He also began laying the groundwork for something else, a foundation. Carmen's name had lived on in their memories, in Miles's drawings, and in the small framed photo that still sat on the mantel. But James wanted more than memory. He wanted legacy. Not in the corporate sense, not in dollars or brick monuments, but in impact. The Carter Foundation for Inclusive Futures launched 6 months after that night on the back steps. Its mission was simple: to support children with disabilities and provide resources to families navigating trauma. James poured not only money, but time into it, attending planning meetings, interviewing staff, visiting local organizations. Claire helped with the design of the programming. Miles became the voice of the campaign's first video. "I'm not just a kid in a chair," he said to the camera, legs wrapped in a bright blue blanket, hands folded in his lap. "I'm a kid who loves music, who likes bad jokes, who wants to climb mountains even if I do it differently. And I want to help other kids believe that too." The video went viral. Interviews followed. Donations poured in. But more importantly, letters came from parents, from children, from teachers and therapists and neighbors, all echoing a single truth: representation matters, visibility heals. And sometimes all it takes is one brave voice to break the silence. James read those letters aloud at the Foundation's inaugural dinner, held in a restored library downtown. Claire sat beside him. Miles sat at the head table, wearing a small tailored suit and a look of disbelief at the attention. But he didn't shrink from it. He leaned into it, answering questions with calm, letting his smile anchor those around him. That night, after the applause had faded and the lights had dimmed, James walked Claire to the car. They moved slowly, unhurried. There was no rush anymore. "I've been thinking," he said as they stood at the driver's door. She tilted her head. "About what?" "About how everything in my life used to be planned," he said. "Mapped out, calculated. And now?" He smiled. "Now I'll wake up wondering what ridiculous thing Miles will say next, and whether you'll burn the toast again." "I don't burn it," she said, laughing. "I crisp it." He took a breath, then reached for her hand. "I want to keep waking up like that." Claire's expression didn't change immediately. She held his gaze, searching, not for doubt, but for truth. "You're sure?" she asked. He nodded. "I'm not sure of anything, but I'm willing." She stepped closer, and in that small space between past and future, they stood without pretense. The next morning, Miles was the first to notice the ring. It wasn't flashy, just a small band on Claire's finger, glinting in the morning light. He stared at it for a moment, then looked up at James. "Does this mean we're stuck with her?" he asked, barely hiding a grin. James raised an eyebrow. "You okay with that?" Miles shrugged. "Only if she keeps making waffles." They were married quietly, surrounded by people who mattered. No press releases, no speeches, just vows exchanged under an old tree in the garden, Claire's hand in James's, Miles grinning in the front row, Pilot sitting proudly in his lap. When their second child was born, a boy with his father's deep eyes and his mother's calm, Miles was the first to hold him. James watched as his son cradled the infant with reverence, whispering something only the baby could hear. He thought then of Carmen, of the life they'd dreamed, and the one he'd found instead. Different, yes, unexpected, but no less worthy. There was no monument large enough to contain the transformation that had taken place in that house. No camera could have captured it, but it lived in the quiet ways they moved around one another now, in the way James instinctively reached for Claire's hand at dinner, in the way Miles rested his head on her shoulder during movie nights, in the way the baby quieted whenever his brother wheeled near. One evening, as twilight settled over the hills, James stood at the edge of the patio, watching Miles push the stroller across the lawn. Claire leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, content. He turned to her, voice low. "We did this." She didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. They had built something that didn't require explanation. A family. Not perfect, not traditional, but real. And in its quiet resilience, it was stronger than anything James had ever constructed in business or logic or pride. He reached for Claire's hand again, and together they watched their son guide the future across the grass, slow but steady, toward whatever came next. If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Check out the next videos and explore more stories like this one. And if it touched you in any way, share it with someone who needs to hear it.